Welcome everyone to today's Gems from the Wisdom Traditions. This is the day before Easter in 2021. And we are so fortunate to have with us someone who is going to be speaking on the early Christian tradition. And from the book that he authored, which is There Ariseth Light in the Darkness, about a novel about the first century in Galilee, and a very important personage to the topic of Easter who lived there. I would like to pass over to Krista Hiser the joyful task of introducing John.
Thank you. I'll do so very briefly so that we can hear from John and have a discussion about this marvelous book. I first read the book as I was entrusted to give it a final proofreading type edit. So I first approached the book as a, editing project, but was so drawn into the characters and the setting, and I was so just astounded by the research that had gone into it. The level of detail is very absorbing, and one thing that really, two things that drew me in about the novel. One was this part, the way that some things that Jesus said that we know as quotations from the Bible are just kind of woven into dialogue of his informal conversations and talks, much like this conversation we have today. He's just talking to people, and little germs of these things that became in the Bible. So that really drew me in. And the other thing that I love about the novel is a conversation that I had with John about how he wanted to publish the novel, which had to do with creating this light. And the light that ariseth is about kind of a difficult time in history, and the light that began to shine and that changed that. So I'll let John decide if he wants to say more about his intention in that regard for the book. And I'm very pleased to turn the conversation over to renowned author J.V. Love.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Krista. As she said, the book is available on Kindle. It's available either electronic version or hard copy, pretty much anywhere. This novel took me about 5 years to write, and what I wanted to answer some questions, and that's going to be part of the reading that I'm going to do today, and I'll ask a question for discussion after the end. Another big question that I really wanted to answer by writing this novel was discovering, we know Jesus's parables and a lot of his teachings, but I think we take them for granted these days, and we don't necessarily understand the context in which they were in. So, to say love your neighbor these days is nothing earth-shattering. But when you go and you do the research back then, a lot of the stuff that he said was earth-shattering back then. He really was quite the revolutionary. So this novel, it only covers Jesus's early ministry. I thought, well, there's plenty of books written covering Jesus's death, and I really wanted to bring more attention to his life instead and his teachings. So the novel picks up actually before he started teaching and concludes with the Sermon on the Mount. So the selection I'm going to read to you today There's a few characters in there. This is from a character named Jonah, who is a middle-aged Jew. He's a physician. And you'll hear a reference to Thomas, which is Jonah's brother who was killed many years ago. And Luke, you'll hear him mentioned. He's in this, and that's Jonah's teenage son. And one last character, Mary. Yes, that Mary Magdalene. You'll hear about her. So I'm going to do a reading, and then I'll invite a bell at the end, and we'll just sit for just a minute to reflect on what I read and what came up for you. And then I'll speak for another minute and begin the discussion. Jonah strode by himself along the familiar twisting road from Magdala to Capernaum. He detected the scent of lavender, which meant he was approaching the large patch of it that marked the halfway point. In Capernaum, he hoped to finally meet the Rabbi Jesus. He'd heard from a friend who passed through the small village earlier that day that the famed rabbi was indeed in town. To give his sore knee a break, he stopped at his usual spot along the route, sitting under a fig tree on a big basalt rock he'd nicknamed Patience. His conversations with the table-sized rock were rather one-sided, but he enjoyed them nonetheless. In between sips from his water skin, Jonah explained to Patience how he and Luke still vehemently disagreed about Luke's desire to avenge Thomas's death. As Jonah listened in vain for a potential resolution, he caught a glimpse of a woman in the distance. She was descending the same hill he'd recently gone down. He eyed her curiously, for it was unusual for a woman to leave the house without a male escort. Besides Azara, there was only one woman he knew of who dared travel wherever she wanted on her own, and he hoped to God it wasn't her. She disappeared from view where the road curved and dipped into a cluster of bushes and trees. When she reappeared a minute later, Jonah cursed under his breath, for he knew that graceful gait could only belong to one person, Mary. Though she lived only a few houses away from him in Magdala, they hadn't spoken to one another in over 2 years, not since the incident. It had occurred while Mary's nephew had been visiting. He and Jonah's son Luke had gotten into a fight. Jonah hadn't known over what. He'd only known what he saw and heard in those few seconds. Luke screaming for help and someone on top of him raining down blows. Charging to the rescue, Jonah had kicked Luke's assailant off, then thrown him headfirst into a stone wall. It was only after the fact that Jonah realized he'd overreacted. Luke had no cuts or bruises, and his assailant had merely been a skinny boy who happened to be as tall as an adult, a boy who was now crying and stumbling down the road toward Mary, who'd witnessed the entire scene from the roof of her house. Besides a nasty bump and a 3-day headache, the boy had suffered no long-term harm. The only lasting repercussion had been Jonah's guilt, Mary's scorn, and the dissolution of their friendship. Pretending to be preoccupied with massaging his knee, Jonah pivoted on the rock to look the opposite way from his approaching neighbor. He didn't want to face her, and he was certain she wanted nothing to do with him. But instead of passing by, her muffled footsteps came to a halt behind him. And after a short eternity, she cleared her throat and spoke. "Jonah, my friend, I want you to know I've forgiven you," she announced in her silvery voice. Jonah peeked over his shoulder at her. She was holding a small bouquet of the purple lavender flowers and standing impossibly straight. He'd always been envious of her ideal posture, whereas many people perpetually bent forward or hunched over as though protecting some shameful secret in their belly. Mary always stood tall with her shoulders back, chest out, and chin level to the ground. In her elegant white headscarf and robes, she came as close as anyone he'd ever met to embodying what he thought an angel would look like. "And I ask you, my brother," she continued, "to please forgive me my animosity toward you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Jonah turned the rest of the way around. He studied her expectant eyes and the soft lines and the olive brown skin of her face to try to determine if she was serious or not. She was. Pressing his hand into the rough, uneven rock, he steadied himself from a suddenly spinning world. Her unguarded, kindly gaze took him by surprise, and he had to look away. "Will you?" she asked a few seconds later. "Will I what?" "Forgive me." "Oh," Jonah said, laughing embarrassedly. "Of course, yes, I forgive you." Not knowing what else to do, he offered her some water, but she waved it off. "But your anger was justified," he added. "I deserved it." "No, you didn't," she said firmly. "We'd been friends for a long time before the incident. You made one mistake and I judged you for eternity. Nobody deserves that." Jonah was speechless. To him, being the first to admit one was wrong was one of the most difficult things to do in life. Not only had she done that, she'd done it confidently. Jonah had always known her as being rather indecisive, but the tone of her voice left no doubt as to her conviction. Mary sat down next to him. "Is this the rock you told me about once? You gave it a name, right? Perseverance?" "Patience," Jonah corrected her. "Oh yes, patience. I'm glad I finally get to meet her." Mary patted the rock with her hand. "Actually, is it a her or a him?" "I don't know," Jonah said with a chuckle. "How does one tell?" Mary shrugged as a slight breeze unexpectedly picked up. "Ugh, it's about time," grumbled Jonah. He pulled away his sticky tunic from his chest in the hope some air would flow inside. Mary moaned and arched her back. "Thanks for the breeze, God." Jonah was struck by the difference in their outlook. While he was bitter and held a grudge about the unbearably hot afternoon, she didn't seem to blame God at all, instead praising him for a momentary gust. "Where are you heading?" asked Jonah. "Capernaum?" "Yes. And you?" Jonah nodded, hoping to catch that new rabbi in town. "Jesus?" "Indeed." "Me too," said Mary. She explained that she'd heard Jesus' talk at the Magdala synagogue and had taken every opportunity since then to hear him speak. She'd been to 5 of his talks already. Jonah wasn't surprised. Jesus' acclaim had spread dramatically in a very short time. In addition to healing the blind and lame, Jonah heard he'd also performed an exorcism. Supernatural acts were important because they provided the proof Jews needed of the rabbi's direct link to God, thus allowing them to trust completely in the rabbi's teachings. "Do you know if he's giving a talk today?" Jonah asked. She shook her head. "A lot of his talks are informal, spur of the moment. When a crowd gathers, he teaches." She pushed herself up from the rock, then dabbed at her thin black eyebrows with a blue kerchief. "Shall we walk together?" "Certainly," replied Jonah, rubbing his knee, "as long as you don't mind going slowly." Normally, he would be nervous about being seen with a woman who was not his wife. But fortunately, everyone in the area knew Mary. By virtue of being of independent means and hailing from an affluent, well-respected family, She was able to do things other women only dreamed of. Not at all, she said. I'm surprised you're out here. I saw you limping around the past few weeks. Didn't your doctor tell you to stay off your feet? Jonah laughed. Yes, but I'm like all the rest of my patients. I never heed my orders. He pulled his water skin over his shoulder. Let's hope we're in luck today. I've been wanting to hear this rabbi for many weeks now. Mary's almond-shaped eyes regarded him quizzically. Didn't you tell me once you got more than your fill of sermons on the Sabbath? Jonah grimaced at her words. It was true. He wasn't usually interested in hearing what rabbis had to say. He mostly blamed the Pharisees and rabbis for the wretched state of the world. He certainly couldn't tell Mary his real reason for seeking out Jesus. I'm intrigued to meet this particular rabbi, he answered. I've heard so much about him, all the miracles, all the healings. With the help of his walking stick, Jonah lifted himself from the rock and flexed his knee a few times. Aren't you worried about him taking business away from you? Not in the least, he answered with a chuckle. He explained that far from hurting Jonah's business as a physician, Jesus was actually making his job easier. Jonah mostly catered to the wealthy and often treated the poor for free. It wasn't the well-to-do Jesus was healing, but primarily the indigent, thus alleviating Jonah's workload. The two of them walked side by side, catching up on all that had transpired in their lives since they'd stopped talking to one another. During every lull in the conversation, Jonah's thoughts returned to Mary's first words to him in over 2 years. Jonah, I want you to know that I've forgiven you. Though he remembered her being sincere.
Don, excuse me. You know, I think it's so important that we be able to hear from you live just a bit. That seems like a wonderful start. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little now, if I could interrupt.
Okay, I've only got like a couple more paragraphs to get to the place I want. Would that be okay? And then
can you skip to it? Can you jump to that place? Yeah, great.
Jonah blurted, I can't stop thinking about what you said to me back on the rock. I understand, replied Mary. I was shocked when I heard it too. You were shocked to hear your own words? No, when I heard Jesus speak about forgiveness, he's mentioned it several times already, how it's important to forgive others. Although the scriptures often mention God forgiving men and women for their faithlessness, Jonah had never read any verse about God's people being asked to forgive. The first time I heard one of his talks, Mary continued, a man asked him how many times he should forgive his brother who had wronged him. Up to 7 times, he asked. And Jesus responded, I tell you, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. Jonah scoffed at the notion. Preposterous. Why would anyone do that? I'm not sure I can explain it, answered Mary. What I think I understand from Jesus is that forgiveness is a way to return to a state of wholeness. It's something you do to free yourself of the past.
Oh, I'm so glad you did get that far. Thank you.
So forgiveness is one of the questions that made me want to write this book, to help me to understand what Jesus really meant, because more than probably any other teacher, he speaks about forgiveness, and it's kind of at the heart of his teachings. I wanted to show that forgiveness, as Jesus was teaching, it was actually a new concept for people then. It was radical, perhaps no more so than when he advocated applying it to non-Jews, even forgiving the much-hated Romans. It's something that's kind of hard to fathom right now, because we're not an oppressed people. But imagine that, somebody else was ruling over everything you did and making their laws, and you had to pay the taxes, and you had no say in it whatsoever. And this radical teacher comes, and he looks upon the Romans the same as he does his Jewish brothers and sisters. He teaches them. He would speak to anybody. And what I continually come back to from what I understand is that forgiveness is a way to free yourself. It lifts a heavy burden from your own shoulders. And as we celebrate Easter tomorrow, we can remind ourselves of how Jesus forgave those responsible for crucifying him. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And when he left the world, he left no trace of bitterness or resentment in his heart. And that's something that we can all strive for in terms of the theme of rising up. So letting go of that baggage from the past and freeing your heart to be open again. And the question I offer for discussion is, how has your view of forgiveness evolved over the years? How has it lifted you up?
What an excellent question. Excellent presentation as well. We get a sense of the context in which that teaching of Jesus's might have been passed on to someone else. And so just right away from the passage you read, I got a sense of what an enormous impact he was having on the personal lives, on the interior lives of the people around him, such that it was having sort of a great ripple effect all around him. With the theme this week of rising up, very much an Easter theme, how have you progressed in your understanding of and living of forgiveness?
I was thinking that part of forgiveness is acceptance. It's accepting that what happened is true, and accepting knowing the heart of the other person that may be broken or have their own stories that they tell. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but forgiveness is the freedom of the self to love the heart of the other person as they are. And with the division of the country, I think that loving people of different and forgiving people of different beliefs and different ways of looking at the world, and still knowing that they are loving human beings and loving their hearts or souls, and not focusing on the dogma, and yet maybe not agreeing with what's going on, but really being able to accept that that's true. And for me, that's a big part of forgiveness. And I think that's really a lot of what's needed in our country right now, is more forgiveness and acceptance. And I think if we had that, we would have more dialogue and openness to touching divine and love, instead of the separation and anger and sadness. And it's a big order, but it has to start somewhere. And I think it starts with each of us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Diana, do you have a personal story of that you'd like to share?
Okay. I think the truth is we have a lot of friends that believe very differently than we believe, and politically. And what we don't talk about politics, but we can be together and love each other. They're very kind and loving people. And it's just allowing the acceptance of who they are, and being able to continue being close together and friends, and understanding their heart. And it's a little different than just forgiveness. And maybe it is forgiveness of them believing something that I don't tolerate or I don't understand. And really coming from a bigger place of love and caring, and seeing their heart and not just what their political ideology is. And from that place, and many that we have that are really close friends, we don't talk about politics because we see things as black and white. And so there's an acceptance or forgiveness that for myself too, that I don't see their side and they don't see mine, but it's coming together with love and a place of really wanting to continue to be close as a family or close as a nation, even though we do believe politically differently. So that's what came to me.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Katharine.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I loved reading the book, and I love that you shared that passage of your book because it sheds light on who taught Jonah how to forgive. It was Mary Magdalene, and he forgives somebody who really, really hurt and killed someone, and not only forgives but sets him free. Forgiveness is hard. I mean, in Judaism, it would be unthinkable how we're talking about, in ancient Judaism, how we're talking about forgiveness. Like we have the power to forgive and it's a personal thing that we do. I mean, I have to admit to you, I've had some people do some real harm to me, real harm. And I don't have the power to forgive them. I don't. But I do have God's power. Please, God, give me the power to forgive these folks. I mean, I think when it comes so close to us, it is a real hard order. And I need God's help. I need God's help. And yeah, I do all the other things, the letting go and all that, but it's when it's so core, I think we have to admit it's difficult to do in our own powers, and that we need God's help in doing that. So thank you. I love the book. I love that you were true to the historical context in which Jesus came. It gives more punch to his words because you're in the context of what was really happening politically and just all of that, the social, political, economic, and ancient grudges. And, you know, when he says, love your enemies, you know, it carries some weight when you know the history. That's why I think it's so good to know the historical context, because then we're in a mess right now, right? We're in a total mess. So to hear Jesus's words and acknowledge he was in a total mess too, the culture and the oppression and all of that was happening, it gives more validity. It puts it on the ground, what Jesus had to say. Yeah. So I love that. I love that about the book because, yeah, the historical context is really good to know. So thank you. And I need help forgiving. God help me.
I'm trying to figure out, you know, Jesus forgives because they don't know what they're doing, right? He forgives because people hurt people without realizing what they're doing. So that's one reason to forgive. Another is, like you said, it's just a burden you carry. And why should you carry this burden? They still have control of you, and if you want to look at it in those terms. But I'm trying to figure out, what are we forgiving? And what's the basis of that forgiving? I don't see how, just on purely personal terms, that's a good basis for forgiveness. We must have, don't we need some conception of the human being beyond the personality? That's my question.
I think if you're wondering in general, just to put this on a personal level, what is it that I need to forgive? You can look in your heart and see where you hold a grudge or some kind of feeling of animosity or something unreleased towards somebody. And that just gives you a hint that there's something there that you really haven't let go of. And you'll hear people who often say, after having done some forgiveness work, if they were to see that person again, they're just seeing them as they are, so that there's no filter there, and they can just treat them as if they hadn't even met them yet, because they've cleared that space. But it's different for everyone. I have a friend that I talk to, and she's had some pretty serious traumatic stuff that has happened to her in her childhood. There is this concept of, you forgive, but you don't forget. So, if somebody has experienced some sexual abuse, for example, you could still forgive that person, but don't ever forget it. And you may choose to never, meet with them again or be around them again. But the forgiveness is really something that's done for yourself. It's not done for the other person.
Krista.
John, when you said that Jesus left this world with no resentments or bitterness, I had this thought that, like, in relation to this rising up idea, like, Jesus left this world and he didn't leave any of those things behind. Whereas if we pass and leave behind a bunch of resentment and bitterness, then, like, everyone else who's still on earth is, like, stuck with it. So this goal to, just be free of resentment, so that you don't stick your resentments with other people that you might leave behind. And not just when you die, but when you leave the room. You don't want to leave a residue of resentment trailing behind you wherever you go.
Yeah.
Wherever I go, I don't want to leave a trail of resentment wherever I go. Thank you.
So it is for some, or it has a result on others besides ourselves when we do forgive. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually reading a book that's showing some of the science they're developing, that your unresolved trauma, things that you could not forgive yourself, how they're passed down actually through the generations. Some of you might be familiar with various forms of this. There's Hellinger's work through the family constellations and such, that you could be experiencing the same trauma that was felt several generations ago because it was never resolved. And so, as Krista was saying, if we can resolve some of this stuff that's happened to us, and some of it, isn't necessarily ours. Some of it is passed down to us, but still, if we can resolve that within ourselves, it stops there. It doesn't get passed down.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. And you were mentioning generations of grudge that were being held at the time that Jesus lived, that some people were able to resolve as a result of his teaching.
I was curious, John, about the timeline of the story. Is this after he's gone away and traveled, and we don't know where he went and studied, perhaps to India? I'm curious the timeline of this piece of the story. Yeah,
the time that it's unknown what happened to Jesus. It's been a lot of speculation, and it's all intriguing. There's not a whole lot of evidence of what exactly he did during all that time, but my novel picks up just, it actually starts when Jesus is young, although he's not really in the book at that point. So by the time Jesus enters the point is when he has started his teachings.
Okay.
Answer it that way.
All right. Yeah, I was just curious because the Buddha is pretty famous for preaching forgiveness as well. And I was just want to reflect on, there was a couple of comments about this notion of forgetting. And I had run across this quote recently, and it may be naive, maybe I've had too easy of a life, but this quote says, "The first to apologize is the bravest, and the first to forgive is the strongest, and the first to forget is the happiest." And I think it might be that next level of really, truly letting go and moving on and being back in this flow of life or in grace.
I'd love to comment a little bit about just the idea of forgiving and forgetting. I guess it's often been something, well, it's sort of like that phrase, forgive and forget, has always sort of raised like a little bit of a red flag for me. Like, I don't know if forgetting is necessarily the best thing, although I can see in some ways like sort of forgiving and being able to move on, or forgiving and doing the work so that that thing that happened to you does not have a charge that then holds you back and sort of causes you to harm others or yourself. You know, I think sometimes forgetting, I mean, if we think about this idea, I've been very interested in this idea of generational trauma. I mean, I think forgetting has gotten us into a lot of trouble. I mean, there's been a lot of forgetting and a lot of denial about a lot of trauma in our country. And so I think, you know, like, we really have a responsibility to like see what has happened and grapple with it and be able to process it in a way that allows us to move forward. And I don't know if that processing in a way that allows us to move forward, if, I guess in my mind, that doesn't have anything to do with forgiving and forgetting, but it could just be sort of like, just forgetting has never really rung true to me.
Are you saying that there's something important about the learning process?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think I could say, well, I'm just going to forget about something. I'm going to put it out of my mind. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have like fully digested it. I fully digested it and understood my role, or understood even understood what it means. I mean, I think I guess it's sort of how do we define forgetting? But I think you're right. It has to do with the learning process. So it's forgiving and digesting and processing so that there is some sort of transformation. So that pain, like if it's a generational pain, whatever it is, that pain becomes kind of fuel for moving forward in some way. Also, just sort of on that topic, it's been interesting for me to think about my trauma or whatever has happened to me as not being my own. Or if I think about what is God, and sort of being able to move beyond my individual self, just the I, it's really been freeing to me, kind of liberating to kind of think about how like what I think of as my trauma is actually something that is generational, that is held by many people in my family, that is held by many people in this culture. And so that has actually been a really liberating thought to me. It's not just my own. It in some way belongs to all of us. And we all have a responsibility to work with it and hopefully move forward in a kind and loving way.
Sarah, did you have a thought?
Yeah, just hearing Janine, what you were saying really very much resonated for me. And I like what you were saying at the end also, that there is this collective experience, this collective trauma, that it almost seems like a easy kind of a cop out to say, I'm just going to forget everything and forget the harms done and all this, and kind of maybe jumping the gun, unless we are so enlightened that we actually are completely absorbed in God and seeing God in everything. But for the most part, most of us are still on the path, kind of. We don't get to just jump to that. Maybe some do, but I do believe that we have to face what's happening. And I really love what you said about the traumas that I have experienced. It's a collective. And to know that we as a collective have this journey of healing that we each have such a part in, and forgiveness, even to look at the meaning of that word, is there's something that it's necessary to integrate what the experiences, what all the feelings that come with it, so that it's very much an integrative thing rather than a forget and throw out, and so we learn from these things. So thank you, Janine. And thank you, John.
And I wonder, Sarah, even those who have attained oneness with God, as you phrased it, someone like that, embodied perhaps by Jesus, by Christ, would be someone who would continue to experience the suffering of others, all the time forgiving, yet that sense of co-suffering. I think that is something that those who put their faith in Jesus really count upon, is that he continues to feel every single little tiny drop of pain in our hearts, and just having that sense of care and compassion that's never ending, from someone who's became one with the divine. So it seems really inspiring, doesn't it? Cheryl, you have a very wise look to you. I would love to hear what your thoughts might be.
Looks are deceiving. No, I've enjoyed listening to this conversation. I am from the Buddhist tradition, although culturally Christian. And there is a great deal in common between those two streams. I am kind of the mind that forgetting completely doesn't seem to make sense. But to not be attached to the pain of whatever that is would be the thing you would want to leave behind.
Great to hear the parallels between the two teachers who taught in a rather similar time frame from the larger perspective. Katharine?
Oh, I just wanted to say, this is such a process, right? Forgiveness is a process, and it came really strong to me. One of my colleagues, a really good friend of mine, Reverend Nicole LaMarche, she's pastor of a UCC church in Boulder. So when trying to help her congregants and herself to grapple with this, they couldn't just skip to forgive and forget. They decided to, they're so upset about our gun laws in this country. They took firearms, and they had a welder, and they all had hammers, and they went out and hammered these guns. And then the process was, what do we do next? And one of the congregants said, well, let's make them into garden tools. And many of you are probably familiar with that in scripture about pounding into plowshares. Mm-hmm. So it's just, here it is, right? Something so current. And they had many people, of course, affected directly and indirectly by that mass shooting in Boulder. So forgiveness is a process. We stay in relationship. My belief is we stay in relationship with God in that process till we work in and through and to it. I can't jump to forgetting until I get to this place where I've expressed and felt the trauma and accepted it or be with it in a way and linked up with other people who also have experienced trauma in that same area, and together is important. I get a little nervous when we're talking about our personal doing it. I mean, it's personal, but it's also communal. So I just admire my colleague for leading her congregation with that.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It sounds to me as if you're talking about the importance of forgiving ourselves along the way, for needing to take some time to forgive, to go through the process rather than just, being able to instantly come upon it. We have to be patient and trust that if that is our intention, that eventually, through the process and through invoking the divine, whether we think of the divine as within or without, or wherever we think of some sense of the greater universe, allowing that greatness to somehow come through us so that we can do an extremely great act of forgiving things that are just beyond comprehension sometimes. Yeah, John.
I just wanted to nudge this idea. We seem to be talking about forgiveness on a very grand scale, forgiving racial injustice or, some incredible trauma inflicted through generations, or something really big for us that we need to get into. And I don't want to constrain that idea of forgiveness, that it's only for the big things. Forgiveness can be used every single day and for the smallest of things. For example, your friend comes an hour late. You can hold on to that resentment in your heart, or you can forgive them. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort, So there's forgiveness that operates very differently depending on what it is you're forgiving. And I'll also just share one practice that I use that really transformed a difficult relationship for me. And the process was very simple. It was about bringing balance to my mind's view, to my mind's memory of what transpired. So somehow, I think probably a lot of you can relate to this. That incident or those couple of incidents, like every time I thought of that person, that's what comes to mind. It came to dominate my view of that person. And the practice I did was, instead of focusing on that, I would recall some of the good times, some of the nice things that person did for me, some of the joy we shared together. And when I did that, it's not that I have to forget about those others, but it brings a lot more balance to the relationship.
Sometimes it feels to me as if the people who make me feel the most uncomfortable, the most angry, or the most as if I really don't like them or can't forgive them, or all the negative feelings that I might have towards somebody, are the people who make me feel the worst about myself. But something about them, maybe it's because of my own reaction to them or something that I've done in regard to them, makes me really uncomfortable with myself. And so looking at that, why do I feel so uncomfortable around this person? For example, like I have to forgive them for something. What is it that's really going on inside of me? sometimes I find out that there's something in me that I need to address, take care of, do differently. Perhaps I need to apologize to them. And then there is also maybe I need to forgive myself. Maybe the way that I treated that person, that I feel terrible thinking about it. So when I look at them, I'm reminded of feeling, it makes me feel bad all over again. I have to address that. And just whatever is the appropriate thing. Maybe I didn't know better. Maybe I wasn't using the best judgment. Maybe, there are all these things. Forgive it, forgive myself, move on. And then it helps me to have a more positive interaction with that other person. Just realizing that it's something that they're causing me to feel about myself that's really at the core of my problem with them. Maybe I feel really intolerant. Maybe I feel really impatient. Maybe I feel all these other things that I don't like to feel about myself. I would say that might be something that helps me to forgive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's, in a way, it's allowing everything to be this beautiful tool to see more clearly, to kind of polish our lens. And instead of just saying, this person did this and I'm going to forgive them because they're horrible, but I'm still going to forgive them. And we can kind of turn it around and say, wait, what's going on inside? I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Renee, as you were talking, it made me think about my best friend who's been my best friend since the 7th grade. And just thinking also, like what John was saying, thinking about forgiveness in like a very personal way, like, being friends with someone for such a long period of time, we definitely have had like some struggles. And like at some point we almost, we're not going to be friends ever again. But we forgave each other. And it's interesting sort of thinking about what that means, because it's certainly, actually, I think about that quite a bit. I mean, not like it's constantly on my mind, but, like every once in a while, I remember that and it makes me really appreciate her. And I feel so grateful that she forgave me and that I forgave her. We somehow were able to still value what we had, even though we caused each other a lot of pain. And so like that sort of horrible moment of time is it's part of our sort of beautiful and multifaceted relationship that has, just changed from the 7th grade until now. But that pain, right? I don't think either of us, I like that someone brought up sort of the idea of attachment. I don't think either of us is like attached to that time when we caused each other pain, but also I think it's part of what makes us like realize what a great thing we have. And it's part of our love. It's part of our love, that pain and also that forgiveness.
Don, do you have any last thing that you might want to share with us on this wonderful occasion? You brought up such an important topic for this time and within the context of Easter.
Tomorrow's Easter. So maybe just think tomorrow about one person you haven't forgiven and see if you can forgive them. And maybe give them a call and tell them that. Thank you, everyone.
What a beautiful, beautiful final note. John, we have a little tradition of someone giving a vote of thanks to the presenter, and I will often throw it out to the participants to see if anyone just spontaneously feels like offering that up.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. I got to kind of tune in from the middle of your reading of your book and just really enjoyed hearing. I could kind of hear the care that you put into really learning, and it just felt like a heart education, that you really took the time for this heart education, and not only for yourself, but it's something that you've been inspired to share. And that very much comes through in this discussion and what you were reading. And so that's a beautiful gift that you are offering to us. And thank you very, very, very much for that. It's a joy to get to meet you on this platform.
Thank everyone who has attended today, and especially thank John for a beautiful presentation, wonderful responses, spurs to more questions, and a beautiful book. I'll just hold it up again. I have really enjoyed reading, especially the passages that have Jesus in conversation, sharing what we've read from the Bible, but in the context where they might more naturally arise in life. So John Love, thank you so much. And aloha everyone else. Happy Easter tomorrow. And let's do make that a day of forgiveness.